In recent years, few legal battles have captured the attention of American gun owners as powerfully as the case of Duncan v. Bonta. This is the lawsuit challenging California's statewide ban on magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. What started as a state-level restriction has grown into a case that could reshape the entire Second Amendment landscape across the nation. Today we're diving deep into what's happening, why it matters, and how the Supreme Court could soon decide whether millions of law-abiding citizens become criminals overnight or whether gun owners across the United States see their rights affirmed in a landmark ruling. To understand the stakes, we have to go back to 2016. That year, California voters passed Proposition 63, a sweeping gun control measure championed by then Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom. One of its most controversial provisions was a ban on so-called large-capacity magazines, defined as anything holding more than 10 rounds. Supporters argued that no civilian should need more than 10 rounds for self-defense, claiming that smaller magazines would limit the damage of mass shootings. Opponents countered that such magazines are standard equipment for countless firearms, from Glock pistols to AR-15 rifles, and that millions of Americans use them responsibly every day for self-defense, sport shooting, and competition. Almost immediately, the law faced legal challenges. Enter Duncan v. Bonta, led by gun owners and supported by organizations like the California Rifle and Pistol Association. The case was assigned to federal judge Roger Benitez, who quickly became a household name among gun rights advocates. In 2019, Benitez struck down the magazine ban as unconstitutional, arguing that magazines are integral to the functioning of many common firearms and therefore protected under the Second Amendment. His ruling unleashed what became known as Freedom Week. For one brief week in March 2019, Californians could legally buy and import magazines over 10 rounds. Gun stores across the state sold out, and it's estimated that hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of magazines entered the state in those 7 days. But the victory didn't last. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals stepped in, and after several rounds of conflicting decisions, the full Ninth Circuit ultimately upheld California's ban. They reasoned that the state had a legitimate interest in reducing gun violence and that limiting magazine capacity was a reasonable restriction. For Californians who had lived through Freedom Week, it was a gut punch. The magazines they had bought legally now existed in a legal gray zone, tolerated temporarily but always under the shadow of potential confiscation or prohibition. Fast forward to today. The case has climbed all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The justices have been asked to review the Ninth Circuit's decision and decide once and for all whether bans on magazines over 10 rounds violate the Second Amendment. And here's where things get complicated. If the Supreme Court refuses to hear the case, the Ninth Circuit ruling stands, and California can enforce its ban fully. That means law-abiding gun owners who bought standard capacity magazines during Freedom Week could suddenly find themselves facing criminal charges, with no compensation for the property they purchased legally. If the court does take the case, however, the ruling could establish a nationwide precedent. States like New York, New Jersey, Hawaii, Colorado, and Oregon, places that have already enacted similar bans, would find their laws under direct threat. In other words, what happens in California won't stay in California. So what exactly is at stake? At the heart of Duncan versus Bonta is a fundamental question. Are magazines that hold more than 10 rounds considered arms protected by the Second Amendment, or are they accessories that states can regulate and ban? Gun rights advocates argue that magazines are essential components of modern firearms. A Glock 17, one of the most popular handguns in the world, is designed around a 17-round magazine. AR-15 rifles, which are owned by millions of Americans, are typically used with 30-round magazines. To limit magazines to 10 rounds, they argue, is to cripple the standard operation of these firearms, making them less reliable and less effective for lawful purposes like self-defense. From this perspective, a magazine is not an optional accessory, it is part of the arm itself. Gun control advocates, however, see it differently. They argue that limiting magazine capacity can reduce the lethality of mass shootings by forcing attackers to reload more often. Each pause, they claim, creates an opportunity for victims to escape or for law enforcement to intervene. While they acknowledge that most gun owners will never misuse their magazines, they insist that public safety justifies the restriction. California's lawyers have framed the ban as a reasonable balance between individual rights and collective safety, pointing to studies suggesting that mass shootings involving larger magazines result in higher casualty counts. Judge Benitez rejected these arguments, noting that constitutional rights are not subject to balancing tests. In his view, the Second Amendment protects arms in common use, and there is no question that magazines over 10 rounds are common. He famously wrote that the ban criminalizes possession of half of all magazines in America. That reasoning resonates strongly with gun owners, who see the law as a direct attack on ordinary, law-abiding people rather than a measure that targets criminals. The Supreme Court's current makeup adds another layer of intrigue, with a conservative majority that has already delivered significant rulings in cases like New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. Many observers believe the court may be inclined to strike down magazine bans. Bruin established that gun regulations must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation, since there's little historical precedent for limiting magazine capacity. Because repeating firearms with high capacity have existed since the 19th century, this standard could spell trouble for California's ban. Still, nothing is guaranteed. The court may decline to hear the case, leaving the Ninth Circuit decision intact, or they may take the case but issue a narrow ruling that applies only to California. The uncertainty has left gun owners across the nation watching anxiously. For those in California, the fear is immediate. If the ban is upheld, police could once again demand that residents surrender or permanently block their magazines. For gun owners in other states, the worry is more long-term. If California's ban stands, it could embolden other states to pass similar restrictions, knowing the courts are likely to uphold them. There's also the question of what happens to the magazines purchased during Freedom Week. California has indicated that it may not grandfather them in. That means every magazine over 10 rounds, whether bought in 2019, 2009, or decades earlier, would be illegal. Imagine buying something legally, using it responsibly for years, and then suddenly being told, you must turn it in or face criminal charges. That's the reality many Californians could soon face if the Supreme Court stays silent. The broader cultural stakes are enormous. For gun rights advocates, Duncan v. Bonta is about more than magazines. It's about whether the government can chip away at the Second Amendment by redefining what counts as an arm. If magazines can be banned today, what's next? Will states try to ban certain calibers of ammunition, certain optics, or other essential parts of firearms? The fear is that once the door is open to restricting commonly owned equipment, the Second Amendment will be reduced to a hollow shell. For gun control supporters, the case is equally important, but for opposite reasons. They see magazine bans as one of the few tools available to reduce the severity of mass shootings. To them, striking down these bans would be a step backward, eliminating a policy that could save lives. They argue that no civilian needs 30 rounds to defend themselves, and that law-abiding gun owners can adapt to 10-round magazines without undue burden. The politics are equally intense. California has positioned itself as a leader in gun control, often pushing the envelope with new restrictions that other blue states later adopt. Losing this case would not only weaken California's laws but also discourage other states from passing similar measures. On the flip side, a win for California would embolden the gun control movement and could set the stage for even stricter regulations. As gun owners, it's important to understand both the legal and practical implications. This case could shape what kind of magazines you're allowed to own, not just in California, but anywhere in the country. It could determine whether the magazines sitting in your gun safe remain legal, or whether you'll be forced to surrender them. And it could redefine how the Second Amendment is interpreted for decades to come. The story of Duncan Bonta is still unfolding, and the next chapter will be written by the Supreme Court. Will they take the case and deliver a decisive ruling? Or will they leave California's ban intact by refusing to intervene? The answer will have consequences far beyond the Golden State. Every American gun owner has a stake in the outcome. As we wrap this up, remember that staying informed is the first step toward protecting your rights. This case is about more than just hardware. It's about the balance of power between states and citizens, between government and individual freedom. Gun owners across America should be paying attention, because what happens in California could soon happen in your state. Whether you own a Glock, an AR-15, or any firearm that relies on standard capacity magazines, your rights are on the line. This is MR.Silencer, reminding you that knowledge is power. Stay sharp, stay prepared, and stay engaged in the fight for your Second Amendment rights. Be sure to like this video, share it with your fellow gun owners, and subscribe for more in-depth analysis on the battles shaping the future of firearms in America. Until next time, take care, train hard, and never take your freedoms for granted.